On a humid August morning in 2022, the hum of camera shutters filled a conference hall in Boston as Colin Angle, the CEO of iRobot, sat side by side with Amazon's devices chief, Dave Limp. Between them, a single contract folder rested on the polished wooden table. Inside was a deal valued at $1.7 billion, an acquisition that, if completed, would bring the maker of the iconic Roomba robot vacuum under Amazon's sprawling empire. The press release framed it as a step toward helping customers save time, but the undercurrent in the room hinted at far more than convenience. Here was a tech behemoth with a growing smart home portfolio, Alexa, Ring, Blink, now reaching for the machines that literally map the intimate layouts of people's homes. The stakes were monumental, not just for shareholders, but for regulators, competitors, and millions of households who had unknowingly been sharing fragments of their private lives with a robot that quietly swept their floors. As microphones were passed around, a reporter from the Washington Post broke the polite corporate rhythm with a pointed question. Was this about market synergy, or was Amazon quietly buying the most intimate dataset on Earth, blueprints of its customers' private spaces? Limp gave the polished answer. We're committed to customer privacy. We see iRobot as a way to innovate faster together. But even as he spoke, lawyers in Washington, Brussels, and London were already drafting inquiry letters. In the shadows of this glossy announcement lay a battle that could reshape the limits of big tech's reach into the physical world. For Amazon, the deal looked like the perfect puzzle piece. Its smart home ambitions were clear: dominate not just online shopping, but the very infrastructure of everyday life. A Roomba, paired with Alexa, could become another listening post, another data stream, another integration point for Amazon's ecosystem. For iRobot, whose revenues had been slipping amid rising competition from Chinese brands like Roborock and Ecovacs, the deal was a lifeline, a chance to secure deep pockets for R&D and survive in a tightening market. Yet that very logic would be the opening shot for antitrust regulators. Was Amazon rescuing an innovator or quietly eliminating a rival from the retail channel it already controlled? By the end of that week, analysts were split. Some called it a game-changing move in the smart home arms race. Others saw a creeping monopolization of household data. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission, under Lina Khan, already known for her aggressive stance on big tech, had this transaction marked in red ink before the ink on the announcement had dried. Across the Atlantic, the European Commission's competition arm had begun informal consultations with consumer advocacy groups, gathering evidence before deciding whether to trigger a full Phase 2 investigation. The clock had started ticking. The public narrative was polished, but beneath it, the tone was already adversarial. Rivals feared Amazon would use its e-commerce dominance to give Roomba preferential treatment, nudging other brands down search results on Amazon's marketplace. Privacy advocates feared something more insidious, that floor plan data from millions of homes could be combined with voice data from Alexa, purchase history from Amazon.com, and video feeds from Ring to create an unprecedented profile of each household. It wasn't just about selling more gadgets, it was about seeing, hearing, and knowing more than any corporation had a right to know. The question now hung in the air, unspoken yet urgent. Was this acquisition the natural next step in home automation innovation, or a calculated move to strangle competition and harvest data under the guise of convenience? Every investor presentation, every regulatory filing, every media interview in the coming months would be colored by that question. And somewhere, in a locked conference room at the FTC, a countdown had begun toward a decision that could greenlight Amazon's vision of a seamlessly integrated smart home, or draw a red line that would define the limits of corporate power in the digital age. The clock was ticking, and the battle lines were quietly being drawn.
Long before the idea of a robot vacuum mapping your living room was even imaginable, A small team of roboticists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology was experimenting with machines built for Mars exploration and military reconnaissance. In 1990, Colin Angle, Rodney Brooks, and Helen Greiner founded iRobot with a vision rooted in academic research and engineering curiosity, rather than consumer gadgets. For its first decade, the company's focus was decidedly non-domestic. Packbot robots cleared mines and war zones, explored disaster sites like Ground Zero after 9/11, and scouted dangerous terrain for NASA. It wasn't until 2002 that iRobot's engineers, leveraging years of autonomy and sensor expertise, introduced the Roomba, a disc-shaped device that could navigate around furniture and clean floors without human supervision. It was quirky, even mocked at first, but within 2 years, Roomba was a household name, selling millions of units, and cementing iRobot as a pioneer in consumer robotics. Amazon's origin story, by contrast, is one of relentless commercial expansion. Founded by Jeff Bezos in 1994 as an online bookstore, it quickly morphed into a marketplace for everything. By the mid-2010s, Amazon had not only redefined e-commerce, but also planted its flag in hardware, with the Kindle, Fire TV, and most disruptively, Alexa-powered Echo devices. Each step into hardware was strategic, creating more touchpoints with customers, generating data, and tying users deeper into Amazon's ecosystem. When it acquired Ring in 2018 and Eero in 2019, the pattern was clear. Amazon was building a smart home empire, device by device, sensor by sensor. The industry context in the years leading up to the 2022 deal was a collision course in the making. The smart home market was booming, fueled by the proliferation of IoT devices and the steady drop in component costs. Yet the landscape was fragmented. Google had Nest, Apple had HomeKit, and dozens of smaller players fought for niches. For robot vacuums specifically, iRobot still commanded brand recognition, but its market share was eroding under price pressure from Chinese competitors, many of which were vertically integrated with their own manufacturing and sold directly through Amazon's platform. Margins were tightening, R&D costs were rising, and iRobot's revenues had declined 7% year-over-year in 2021. The company's dependence on Amazon as a retail channel was becoming both a lifeline and a risk. On Amazon's side, the logic of an iRobot acquisition was almost inevitable. The company had already linked Alexa with smart lights, thermostats, security cameras, and locks. But a mobile device that roamed every room, sensing obstacles and mapping spaces, was a missing link, an untapped source of environmental data that could further personalize Amazon's services. Combine that with the ability to push Roomba to the top of search results on its own marketplace, Amazon could both dominate the category and reinforce its smart home moat against Google and Apple. The vulnerabilities of both companies converged in 2022. For iRobot, the rising cost of components due to supply chain disruptions during the pandemic had cut deep into profitability. The company had laid off 10% of its workforce in mid-2022 and was under pressure from investors to find a strategic partner. For Amazon, slowing growth in its core retail business and increased scrutiny from regulators meant that future expansion had to be justified as innovation, not just market capture. An iRobot deal could be sold as both, an innovative leap in home automation and a way to keep American robotics leadership competitive against foreign rivals. And so in early summer of 2022, preliminary talks began. Sources familiar with the matter would later reveal that Amazon's M&A team approached iRobot with a pitch that focused not just on capital and distribution, but on unlocking the next chapter of home intelligence. To the public, it sounded like synergy. To rivals and regulators, it sounded like consolidation. The idea of a merger was not born overnight. It was the product of decades of parallel growth, technological convergence, and a smart home industry racing towards a future where control over data would determine control over the market. The timing could hardly have been more consequential. By the time the deal was announced in August, the political winds had shifted against big tech, and antitrust scrutiny was at its highest in decades. Yet for both Amazon and iRobot, this was the moment. They believed the benefits, at least on paper, outweighed the storm they were sailing into.
By the time Amazon and iRobot signed their agreement in August 2022, the global robot vacuum market had matured into a fiercely competitive, multi-billion-dollar segment. iRobot, despite being the pioneer, controlled roughly 46% of the US market, but had seen its global share shrink to around 32%, according to Euromonitor data. Chinese brands, most notably Roborock, Ecovacs, and Xiaomi, were surging, often undercutting Roomba's prices by 30 to 50%, while offering comparable or even superior navigation features. In Europe, iRobot faced stiff competition from brands like Miele and Vorwerk, entrenched in regional markets with loyal customer bases. Measured by the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI, the robot vacuum sector was still moderately concentrated, but in the United States, iRobot's dominance skewed the numbers. Regulators knew that if Amazon, already commanding over 60% of the US online retail market, were to absorb iRobot, the effective concentration in both product distribution and market control could cross thresholds that trigger serious antitrust concerns. The Federal Trade Commission's economists had seen this pattern before: a vertical integration where the distributor was also the category leader's owner, with potential to foreclose rivals by manipulating search rankings, advertising slots, and pricing algorithms. Geographically, the smart home ecosystem, of which robot vacuums are a part, showed stark disparities. In North America, Amazon's Alexa ecosystem had a commanding lead, integrated with millions of homes. In Europe, Google's Nest had stronger penetration in some regions, while Apple's HomeKit remained a premium niche choice. The strategic value of iRobot lay not just in selling more devices, but in embedding another sensor-rich node into Amazon's existing smart home network, a network already capable of synchronizing lights, locks, cameras, and voice assistants. Barriers to entry in this segment were significant. While the basic mechanics of a robot vacuum could be replicated, the software for advanced navigation, the brand trust required for in-home devices, and the retail shelf space, both physical and digital, were harder to acquire. Amazon controlled the single most important retail gateway, its own e-commerce platform. Competitors like Shark Ninja or Ecovacs could theoretically innovate, but if Amazon owned the top brand in the category, it could adjust visibility, pricing, or bundling in ways that would subtly but effectively steer consumers toward Roomba. Past legal precedents gave regulators cause for vigilance. The European Commission's case against Google Shopping in 2017 for self-preferencing search results loomed large as an analogy. Control the platform, and you can invisibly tilt the playing field. In the US, the FTC had already signaled in its 2021 suit against Facebook's acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp that vertical integration with dominant market share could be grounds for intervention. Even without direct evidence of harm, the potential for foreclosure, especially in a market as concentrated as smart home hardware, was enough to warrant deep scrutiny. Numbers told an even sharper story. In 2021, iRobot generated approximately $1.56 billion in revenue, with over 75% of its sales coming from just 3 regions: the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. Nearly 90% of its US sales were funneled through Amazon's marketplace. This dependence was a glaring vulnerability, one that regulators feared could be weaponized against competitors if Amazon took control. Conversely, from Amazon's perspective, these figures represented an opportunity to capture more value per customer, bundling Roombas with Prime memberships, offering Alexa-based cleaning schedules, and integrating product recommendations into daily household routines. The market's structural reality meant that this was no ordinary merger. It wasn't just a tech giant buying a hardware manufacturer. It was a platform owner potentially absorbing a category leader that depended on that very platform. The statistical concentration, the vertical relationship, and the data convergence made this acquisition different from a traditional horizontal merger in consumer electronics.
And it was precisely this combination that put regulators on high alert before the ink was dry on the agreement. The numbers, far from neutral, were already shaping the battle ahead. They hinted at the power Amazon could wield, not just in the robot vacuum market, but across the smart home landscape if this deal were allowed to proceed without conditions.
From Amazon's perspective, the iRobot acquisition was a textbook example of strategic alignment, at least on paper. The company's executives framed it as a natural evolution of their smart home vision, creating a seamless, intelligent ecosystem where devices communicate, learn, and anticipate user needs without friction. A Roomba was not merely a cleaning device. It was a mobile sensor platform capable of capturing spatial data, environmental conditions, and usage patterns. Paired with Alexa's voice control, Ring's video surveillance, and Blink's motion detection, it could form part of a fully integrated home network that Amazon alone could orchestrate. The internal pitch decks to investors painted an even more ambitious picture. Imagine an Echo device detecting your voice command to clean the living room, instantly triggering a Roomba to start, while Ring cameras verify no one is in the way and Eero routers optimize Wi-Fi channels for uninterrupted navigation. Every step of this interaction would pass through Amazon's cloud services, generating data points to refine algorithms, improve customer recommendations, and strengthen Prime loyalty. The synergies weren't just operational, they were experiential, binding customers more tightly to Amazon's ecosystem in ways competitors could not easily replicate. On the financial side, Amazon touted cost efficiencies and supply chain leverage. iRobot's manufacturing, though already globalized, could benefit from Amazon's logistics muscle, potentially reducing shipping costs and smoothing inventory cycles. Joint R&D could accelerate feature development, voice integration, AI-driven cleaning patterns, energy optimization, and marketing and cross-selling opportunities could multiply sales without proportionally increasing customer acquisition costs. The company argued that bundling Roombas with Prime subscriptions or offering exclusive Alexa features could drive adoption and reduce churn. For iRobot, the rationale was equally compelling. The company had been squeezed by rising component costs, aggressive pricing from Asian competitors, and pandemic-related supply chain bottlenecks. Joining forces with Amazon promised not just financial stability, but a platform to showcase innovations without being buried under cheaper alternatives on the same retail site. In investor calls, CEO Colin Angle stressed that the partnership could unlock the next wave of home robotics, citing the need for resources to invest in next-generation devices beyond vacuuming, robotic mowers, home assistants, and AI-driven home monitoring systems. Yet hidden within the glowing language of synergy were points that regulators would inevitably scrutinize. Efficiencies in distribution could also mean exclusion of rivals. Cost savings from consolidated supply chains might be achieved by favoring Amazon's retail channels at the expense of third-party sellers. The ability to integrate data streams across devices, while innovative, raised questions about how that data would be used and whether it could create insurmountable barriers for competitors. Industry analysts noticed that some of Amazon's claimed synergies overlapped suspiciously with potential anti-competitive advantages. Vertical integration could allow Amazon to self-preference Roombas in search results, replicate Google's controversial tactics in the shopping case, and subtly nudge consumer choice without overtly breaching antitrust laws. If the integration of iRobot's mapping data into Alexa's ecosystem became exclusive, it could give Amazon a spatial intelligence advantage that no competitor could match, locking consumers into its smart home framework for years. Still, Amazon's public narrative remained laser-focused on consumer benefit. Press releases emphasized convenience, innovation, and lowering barriers to smart home adoption. One spokesperson declared, "We see a future where home automation is effortless, where your devices work together to make life better for everyone." It was a compelling vision, but one that required regulators, investors, and the public to trust that the efficiencies Amazon promised would indeed pass through to consumers, rather than simply fortifying its already dominant market position. The strategic rationale was thus a double-edged sword. To investors, it was a story of expansion, synergy, and market leadership. To skeptics, it was a blueprint for deepening control over consumer data and digital infrastructure.
And as the deal moved into the scrutiny phase, this tension between the promised benefits and the potential for harm would define the coming battle.
The agreement between Amazon and iRobot, announced on August 5, 2022, carried a headline value of $1.7 billion, structured entirely as an all-cash transaction. Amazon committed to paying $61 per share, representing a 22% premium over iRobot's closing price the day before the announcement. For iRobot's shareholders, it was a swift and definitive offer. No stock swaps, no drawn-out valuation disputes. The clean, cash-based structure signaled Amazon's intent to close quickly and decisively, even in a climate where regulators were increasingly aggressive. Beyond the headline number, the deal included several telling provisions. Chief among them was a hell or high water clause, obligating Amazon to take all necessary steps, including legal challenges, to secure regulatory approval. This clause is not standard in all acquisitions, and its presence here indicated Amazon's awareness of the antitrust headwinds it was facing. It was both a message to iRobot's leadership, Amazon was committed, and a signal to the market that the company anticipated a fight. The timeline laid out in the merger agreement was ambitious. The parties targeted a closing in late 2022 or early 2023, contingent on regulatory approvals in multiple jurisdictions, including the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. The first milestone was the filing of the Hart-Scott-Rodino notification with the Federal Trade Commission, which triggered the standard 30-day waiting period. Given the political climate, insiders expected a second request for additional information, essentially a deep dive investigation that could extend the process by several months. In Europe, a notification to the European Commission's Directorate General for Competition was planned for early 2023, with an eye toward avoiding overlap with other high-profile tech merger reviews. The agreement also included a breakup fee, reportedly set at $94 million, roughly 5.5% of the deal's value, payable by Amazon to iRobot if the transaction was blocked due to regulatory action. While modest by mega-deal standards, the fee was meaningful for a company of iRobot's size, providing a cushion against the risk of a failed merger. Conversely, there was no reverse breakup fee on iRobot's side. The burden of navigating the regulatory gauntlet rested squarely on Amazon's shoulders. Another noteworthy provision was an exclusivity clause, preventing iRobot from soliciting or entertaining competing acquisition offers while the Amazon deal was pending. This effectively locked iRobot into the transaction for the duration of the regulatory review, reducing its leverage but ensuring Amazon would not be outbid or undercut by a strategic rival. From announcement to anticipated close, the clock was set for roughly 6 to 9 months, a brisk schedule for a cross-border tech acquisition under heavy antitrust scrutiny. Yet almost immediately, industry observers questioned whether that target was realistic. The FTC, under Chair Lina Khan, had already slowed or blocked several high-profile deals, from NVIDIA Arm to Meta Within. In Brussels, the European Commission had shown similar resolve, signaling that any merger involving sensitive data and market concentration would face extended review. The deal terms thus became more than just a contractual framework. They were a strategic statement. By agreeing to aggressive obligations and a defined breakup fee, Amazon projected confidence, perhaps hoping to frame the narrative as one of inevitable approval. But to regulators, those same terms underscored the stakes, a tech giant so determined to acquire a data-rich hardware company that it was willing to fight to the end. Every milestone, HSR filing, EU notification, UK submission, was now a checkpoint in a high-stakes countdown. Each came with the possibility of procedural delays, legal challenges, or demands for remedies that could reshape the transaction entirely. And as the ink dried on the agreement, the next phase was already unfolding, the first public and market reactions to a deal that would soon dominate headlines in both the business and political press.
Within hours of the August 5, 2022 announcement, the market's reaction revealed a split personality. On Wall Street, iRobot's stock leapt nearly 19% in a single trading day, closing just shy of Amazon's $61 offer price, a signal that investors saw the deal as credible, but were still pricing in some regulatory risk. Amazon's own stock barely moved, reflecting its massive scale. $1.7 billion was little more than a rounding error in a company valued at over $1 trillion. Still, analysts noted the strategic symbolism. Amazon was doubling down on hardware and smart home integration despite mounting antitrust scrutiny. Financial analysts from firms like Morgan Stanley and Bernstein issued quick notes. Bulls framed the acquisition as a smart long-term play, citing iRobot's brand dominance, patent portfolio, and potential data integration with Alexa. Bears, however, warned that the FTC's Lina Khan had both the political capital and the legal will to make Amazon an example. This is the kind of vertical integration that keeps antitrust enforcers up at night, one Bernstein analyst wrote, adding that the deal's reliance on sensitive in-home mapping data would light up the radar in both DC and Brussels. Rivals wasted no time in seizing the moment. Shark Ninja, a key competitor in the U.S. market, issued a carefully worded statement urging regulators to preserve consumer choice and fair competition in connected home products. Chinese manufacturers like Roborock and Echovacs remained quieter in public, but industry insiders reported that their lobbying teams in Washington were already contacting trade associations to coordinate a response. Their core argument was straightforward. If Amazon owned iRobot, it could prioritize Roomba listings on Amazon.com, throttle advertising opportunities for competitors, and bundle Prime exclusive deals that smaller players could never match. Media coverage quickly broadened the conversation. The Washington Post, owned by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, reported the deal in neutral corporate language. But the New York Times and The Guardian struck a more critical tone, highlighting privacy concerns and drawing parallels to previous antitrust cases. Tech blogs like The Verge and Wired zeroed in on the data vacuum angle, explaining how modern Roombas use LiDAR and cameras to create detailed floor plans, information that, if linked to other Amazon datasets, could provide an unprecedented profile of a household's habits, layout, and routines. Consumer advocacy groups, including the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC, and Public Citizen, issued rapid press releases. EPIC warned that Amazon's growing empire of in-home surveillance devices, from doorbells to voice assistants, now threatens to extend into the physical mapping of private living spaces. Public Citizen called on the FTC to block the deal outright, framing it as a direct threat to competition and privacy in the connected home sector. Public sentiment on social media was mixed but loud. Some users joked about Roomba snitching to Alexa about the crumbs under your couch, while others expressed genuine alarm. Hashtags like DataVacuum and Stop Amazon Roomba trended briefly on Twitter, fueled by a blend of satire and serious privacy activism. The story had crossed the line from a niche business headline into a broader cultural debate. Within the first week, it was clear that battle lines were forming. On one side, Amazon and iRobot projected a calm, optimistic front, with joint statements emphasizing innovation, convenience, and job creation. On the other, competitors, privacy advocates, and a growing segment of the press were shaping a counter-narrative, that this was less about helping customers clean their floors and more about cleaning out the competition and sweeping up unprecedented amounts of personal data in the process. The speed and intensity of the reaction surprised even seasoned dealmakers. What was supposed to be a polished, strategic announcement had become a public test case for the limits of big tech expansion. And as the noise grew louder, regulators had little choice but to take notice.
As the news cycle around Amazon's acquisition of iRobot intensified, the conversation widened to include voices beyond investors, rivals, and regulators. At the heart of the debate were the stakeholders whose daily lives, businesses, and privacy could be reshaped by the deal: consumers, suppliers, retail partners, and advocacy groups who understood the stakes in concrete human terms. For consumers, the reaction was deeply personal.
owners of Roombas, especially the more recent models with advanced mapping capabilities, began asking pointed questions online. Would their home layouts, stored in the cloud for navigation purposes, now be cross-referenced with Amazon's vast trove of shopping and behavioral data? Amazon's assurances about privacy felt thin to those who had already witnessed the company's integration of Alexa voice data into advertising strategies. The trust that iRobot had built over 2 decades was suddenly on trial, with some longtime customers vowing to switch brands if the deal went through without ironclad data protections. Suppliers and manufacturing partners watched with mixed emotions. On the one hand, Amazon's global logistics network promised scale and efficiency that could stabilize orders and smooth the volatile supply chain disruptions that had plagued iRobot since the pandemic. On the other, there was concern about Amazon's history of squeezing margins in pursuit of cost efficiencies. Smaller component suppliers feared that being locked into Amazon's procurement system could mean trading away pricing power for volume, leaving them more dependent on a single dominant customer. Retail partners outside the Amazon ecosystem also had reason to worry. Big box stores like Best Buy and Target had been important distribution channels for iRobot, often using Roomba as a high-visibility product in their smart home aisles. If Amazon decided to channel more inventory through its own platform or bundle Roombas with Prime promotions, those retailers could lose a key traffic-driving product line. Executives privately discussed whether they might have to diversify their smart home offerings to avoid being sidelined. The advocacy world mobilized quickly. Consumer rights organizations like Consumer Reports and the Electronic Frontier Foundation began preparing public statements and outreach campaigns. Their core message: the merger could erode both competition and privacy. They drew on recent history, pointing to Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp, which had been followed by changes to privacy policies despite early promises, to warn that even well-intentioned corporate assurances can dissolve under commercial pressure. Real-world anecdotes began surfacing in the press and on social media, giving the debate a visceral dimension. One New York couple told NBC News that their Roomba had captured images of them in their living room, images that had ended up in a data annotation system used by iRobot contractors. Although iRobot said such incidents were rare and controlled, the story fed public fears about how in-home data could leak or be repurposed once under Amazon's control. Labor unions too entered the fray. While iRobot's workforce was relatively small, about 1,200 employees at the time of the deal, union representatives in Massachusetts and Rhode Island raised concerns about job security. They questioned whether Amazon's history of automating and streamlining operations could lead to layoffs, particularly in non-engineering roles. Some even suggested that integrating iRobot into Amazon's device division could mean relocating or consolidating offices, disrupting local economies. The sum of these voices created a multi-layered pressure front. Consumers feared losing privacy and choice. Suppliers weighed efficiency gains against loss of bargaining power. Retail partners worried about being cut out. Advocacy groups warned of irreversible concentration of data and market control. Even employees faced uncertainty about their future. By early September 2022, these concerns had coalesced into a broader social narrative. This was not just a corporate transaction, but a shift in the balance of power in the connected home. And it was a shift that could touch not only the wallets of consumers, but the sanctity of their private spaces. That narrative, amplified by every stakeholder group, ensured that regulators could not treat the deal as just another line item in the M&A pipeline.
By the second week after the deal's announcement, the Amazon iRobot transaction had moved from a market headline to a marked entry on regulators' priority lists in multiple jurisdictions. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, under Chair Lina Khan, took the lead. The FTC received the Hart-Scott-Rodino filing and, as expected, issued a second request for information. This was no formality.
It signaled that the agency intended to conduct a full-scale antitrust review, demanding tens of thousands of documents, internal emails, sales data, and competitive analyses from both Amazon and iRobot. The scope was wide. The FTC would examine whether the merger violated Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which prohibits acquisitions that may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. In Brussels, the European Commission's Directorate General for Competition, DG Comp, began its own pre-notification talks. Under the EU merger regulation, officials were assessing whether to proceed with a formal Phase 1 review or move directly to a Phase 2 investigation, a step reserved for deals with serious competition concerns. European regulators were particularly focused on two theories of harm: potential foreclosure of rival robot vacuum brands from Amazon's marketplace, and the risk of combining sensitive in-home mapping data with other personal data sets in violation of the Digital Markets Act. The United Kingdom's Competition and Markets Authority, CMA, was not far behind. Having recently blocked Meta's acquisition of Giphy, the CMA had shown a willingness to intervene in high-profile tech deals even when the companies were based abroad. Officials signaled early that they would investigate whether Amazon's control over online retail channels could harm competition in the UK's growing smart home market. Regulators across these jurisdictions were comparing notes, informally coordinating to share competitive intelligence. While their legal frameworks differed, the underlying concerns aligned: market foreclosure, data concentration, and the long-term impact on innovation. The notion of self-preferencing loomed large in their preliminary analysis. If Amazon could promote Roombas over rival products in search rankings, sponsored ads, and product recommendations, it could subtly shift consumer choice without overtly breaching marketplace rules. Privacy regulators, too, began to take notice. In the EU, officials from the European Data Protection Board issued interest in whether the merger could create a new category of personal data risk. Roomba's spatial maps linked to Amazon accounts could theoretically be combined with voice, video, and purchase history to build an intimate, three-dimensional profile of a household. While Amazon denied any such plans, regulators had learned from past mergers that stated intentions could evolve once integration was complete. The procedural steps ahead were clear, but fraught. In the US, the FTC could either negotiate a consent decree with behavioral or structural remedies, file a lawsuit to block the deal, or clear it outright. In the EU, a Phase 2 review would mean months of evidence gathering, market testing of theories of harm, and possibly issuing a statement of objections, a formal charge sheet outlining why the deal should be blocked or conditioned. In the UK, the CMA's ability to impose remedies independently could mean Amazon could face divergent outcomes in different jurisdictions. The very fact that so many agencies were circling the deal underscored its significance. This was not simply about two companies joining forces. It was about the precedent such a merger could set in the age of smart home convergence. Regulators had in their hands a test case for how far they were willing to go to limit the vertical integration of dominant digital platforms with data-rich hardware manufacturers. And as the early filings came in, it was clear that no matter the outcome, the process itself would be a battle measured in months, not weeks.
Even before the ink dried on the second request from the FTC, Amazon was already mobilizing one of its most seasoned playbooks: influence and narrative control. The company's lobbying apparatus in Washington, D.C., long regarded as one of the most sophisticated in the corporate world, was put on high alert. Federal filings later showed that Amazon retained multiple heavyweight firms, including Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and S3 Group, each with deep connections to antitrust committees and congressional leadership. Budgets for the quarter surged, with lobbying expenditures reportedly topping $4.5 million in Q3 2022, an increase that coincided directly with the iRobot review period. The message Amazon pushed to policymakers was carefully crafted, internally referred to as the American Robotics Competitiveness Narrative. It positioned the acquisition as a vital move to keep the U.S. ahead in a global race against Chinese hardware giants. Roomba, they argued, was one of the few truly American-born consumer robotics brands, and allowing it to languish under competitive pressure from subsidized foreign manufacturers would be a strategic blunder.
Talking points highlighted job preservation, manufacturing partnerships, and the potential for new product lines that could strengthen domestic innovation. In parallel, Amazon's public relations teams launched a softer campaign aimed at shaping consumer sentiment. Sponsored content began appearing in tech and lifestyle media outlets, telling human interest stories of how Roombas had improved quality of life for busy parents, seniors, and people with disabilities. Subtle but consistent in these narratives was the theme of accessibility, how integration with Alexa could make home cleaning easier for the elderly or those with mobility challenges. These stories carried no overt political message, but they humanized the product at the very moment regulators were framing the deal in the cold language of market concentration. There were also grassroots-style efforts, some genuine, some less organic. On social media, a handful of user advocacy pages popped up, urging followers to save Roomba from foreign competitors and calling on regulators to approve the merger. Investigative reporters at Politico later noted that several of these accounts were linked to marketing firms with prior contracts for Amazon's political campaigns, a classic example of astroturfing, where a corporate agenda is masked as citizen activism. At the same time, Amazon's executives took a more direct role in narrative management. Colin Angle, iRobot's CEO, became a fixture in interviews on CNBC and Bloomberg, emphasizing that the merger would supercharge innovation and ensure that Roomba remained at the cutting edge. Dave Limp, Amazon's devices chief, reinforced the privacy message, stating unequivocally that customer mapping data will not be used for targeted advertising. While critics pointed out that similar pledges had eroded in past tech mergers, the repetition of this assurance was deliberate, testing whether constant, confident messaging could erode public skepticism. However, the campaign was not without backlash. Journalists at The Intercept and Gizmodo dissected the American competitiveness talking points, arguing that they were designed to deflect from the core antitrust issues. Privacy watchdogs called the PR blitz a distraction from the merger's potential to consolidate unprecedented amounts of in-home data. Even some members of Congress, particularly on the House Judiciary Committee's Antitrust Subcommittee, publicly warned Amazon against trying to lobby its way out of legitimate competition concerns. Despite the pushback, Amazon's multi-pronged approach succeeded in one respect. It kept the company's framing of the deal in circulation alongside the criticism. By flooding the narrative space with stories of innovation, jobs, and consumer benefit, Amazon ensured that when regulators eventually moved toward a formal decision, they would do so in an environment where the company's arguments were not just known, but normalized. This was more than a legal defense. It was an information war. And as with any war of narratives, the real battle was over which storyline would harden into the public's default understanding of the deal.
The first public hearing on the Amazon iRobot deal took place on a brisk morning in late October 2022 in a packed chamber at the Federal Trade Commission's headquarters in Washington, D.C. The room had that peculiar mix of formality and tension that signaled both high stakes and political theater. Rows of suited lawyers and staffers lined the walls. Reporters filled every seat in the press section, and camera crews from major networks were already broadcasting live. At the long central table sat representatives from both companies, Colin Angle for iRobot, his tie a muted navy, flanked by the company's general counsel. Dave Limp for Amazon, flanked by a team of antitrust attorneys from WilmerHale and Covington and Burling. FTC Chair Lena Khan presided over the proceedings, flanked by Commissioners Rebecca Slaughter, Alvaro Bedoya, and Christine Wilson. Khan's expression was unreadable as she opened with a pointed summary. This hearing concerns not merely the sale of a hardware company, but the acquisition of data, distribution channels, and potentially market power in an emerging sector of the smart home. The tone was set. The first questions drilled into market foreclosure. Commissioner Slaughter asked Limp whether Amazon would commit in binding form not to prioritize Roomba search results or alter competitor placement on its marketplace. Limp replied, "Amazon's success comes from offering customers the widest possible choice, a carefully worded statement that avoided any concrete pledge." This evasiveness drew a subtle but noticeable murmur from the audience. Colin Angle's testimony was more personal, weaving iRobot's origin story into an argument for survival. He spoke about the company's pioneering role in robotics, its shrinking margins in the face of global competition, and how Amazon's backing could ensure continued innovation. Quote, "Without a partner like Amazon, our ability to invest in the next generation of robotics will be severely constrained," unquote. His voice carried conviction, but the commissioners seemed unmoved, pivoting quickly to privacy. Commissioner Bedoya held up a glossy photo of a Roomba with a camera module. These devices can map the inside of a home. Can you guarantee that none of that data will be cross-referenced with Amazon purchase histories, Alexa recordings, or Ring camera footage? Limp answered with the now familiar line, "We will not use mapping data for targeted advertising." Bedoya pressed, "That's advertising. What about other forms of personalization or product development?" The question hung heavy. Limp offered a non-committal promise to review data practices in accordance with our privacy policy. One of the more dramatic moments came when FTC counsel introduced a slide from internal Amazon strategy documents obtained during discovery. The slide, dated March 2022, described integrated spatial intelligence as a future differentiator in smart home services. While the language was broad, it hinted at precisely the kind of data fusion regulators feared. Amazon's lawyers objected to the characterization, but the visual impact was undeniable. Public interest representatives were also given time to speak. An advocate from the Electronic Privacy Information Center warned that once this merger is complete, reversing its impact will be nearly impossible. Your home's blueprint will just be another data point in Amazon's universe, unquote. A representative from a consumer rights coalition argued that Amazon's track record with third-party sellers demonstrated a willingness to tilt the playing field once it controlled both platform and product. The hearing ended without a definitive next step, but the mood in the chamber was clear. This was not going to be a quiet procedural review. The commissioners had signaled that they were prepared to dig deep, challenge corporate assurances, and put both companies under a microscope. Outside, reporters swarmed the company representatives, seeking sound bites for the evening news. Inside, the legal teams were already strategizing for what promised to be a prolonged and public battle. The battlefield had been defined, and both sides now understood the scrutiny would be as much about optics and trust as it was about legal standards.
The opposition's case against the Amazon iRobot merger crystallized into a set of interlocking theories of harm, each aimed at convincing regulators that allowing the acquisition would irreversibly distort competition in the smart home and robot vacuum markets. At the core was a vertical integration argument. Amazon, already the dominant online retail platform in the United States, with control over more than 60% of e-commerce sales, would be acquiring the category leader in robot vacuums, a product that depended heavily on Amazon's own marketplace for distribution. The first prong was foreclosure risk. Antitrust economists for the FTC argued that once Amazon owned iRobot, it could subtly or overtly degrade the visibility of competing products like Shark, Roborock, or Ecovacs on Amazon.com. This could take the form of altered search rankings, reduced access to sponsored placements, or changes in recommendation algorithms that prioritize Roombas in product bundles. Even if Amazon denied such intentions, the FTC pointed to past allegations in unrelated cases where Amazon had been accused of self-preferencing its private label goods. The analogy to the European Commission's 2017 Google shopping case where Google was fined €2.42 billion for favoring its own comparison service, was repeatedly invoked as a cautionary precedent. The second prong was data concentration. Modern Roombas, particularly the high-end J7 Plus and S9 Plus models, use advanced LiDAR sensors and cameras to create detailed maps of a home's layout. This spatial data, critics argued, was qualitatively different from the consumer behavior data Amazon already held. Combined with Alexa voice recordings, Ring camera feeds, and Prime purchase histories, it could produce an intimate, three-dimensional profile of households, information no competitor could match without equivalent device penetration. The FTC's theory was that such a data advantage could create insurmountable barriers for rivals, stifling innovation and locking consumers deeper into Amazon's ecosystem. The third prong involved potential harm to innovation. Opponents claimed that independent iRobot had strong incentives to partner across platforms, integrating with Google Assistant, Apple HomeKit, and other ecosystems. Once under Amazon's ownership, those integrations could be deprioritized or limited, forcing consumers toward Alexa as the default smart home hub. This could reduce cross-platform interoperability, making it harder for competitors to compete on features rather than just price. Consumer harm was the through line connecting these arguments. While prices for Roombas might not rise immediately, indeed they could even drop in the short term due to bundling with Prime, regulators warned that reduced competition would eventually lead to fewer choices, slower innovation, and diminished privacy protections. As one FTC staffer put it in a leaked memo, the absence of an immediate price increase does not mean the absence of harm. It often means the harm is structural and delayed. Supporting these theories were case studies from other sectors. The FTC's lawyers referenced Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods in 2017, where initial price cuts were followed by gradual shifts in supplier terms and private label expansion that disadvantaged competing grocers. They also cited Microsoft's bundling of Internet Explorer with Windows in the late 1990s as a historical example of leveraging dominance in one market to capture another. The European Commission's competition unit echoed many of these points in its own preliminary findings. DG Comp emphasized that Amazon's control over the marketplace gave it gatekeeper power as defined under the Digital Markets Act. Merging with iRobot could allow it to exercise that power in ways that subtly but systematically favored its own hardware, without consumers being fully aware of the manipulation. Privacy advocates amplified the narrative, arguing that once the merger was complete, any voluntary commitments on data use could be rolled back, as had happened in past tech mergers. They painted a picture of data creep, where information collected for navigation could later be repurposed for targeted marketing, behavioral prediction, or even home insurance underwriting. In sum, the case against the merger was not about a single obvious harm, but a network of risks, each plausible on its own, but collectively presenting a picture of a deal that could reshape an entire sector for the long-term detriment of competition, consumer choice, and privacy. Regulators now had to decide whether these risks were speculative or whether they represented an unacceptable gamble with the future of the connected home.
Amazon and iRobot mounted a robust defense to counter the allegations levied against their merger, emphasizing the verifiable efficiencies and consumer benefits that they argued would flow from the deal. Central to their argument was the assertion that the integration of Amazon's technological infrastructure with iRobot's hardware expertise would accelerate innovation in the smart home sector, ultimately delivering improved products and services to consumers faster than either company could achieve alone. Executives highlighted several merger-specific efficiencies. First, the ability to leverage Amazon's cloud computing resources and AI capabilities promised to enhance Roomba's navigation algorithms and predictive maintenance features, potentially reducing operational downtime and increasing device lifespan. Amazon's expansive logistics network was touted as a way to improve inventory management, reduce shipping times, and lower distribution costs, savings that the companies claimed would be passed on to customers in the form of lower prices and improved availability. The companies also pointed to their commitment to maintaining iRobot's multi-platform compatibility. They stressed that Roomba devices would continue to integrate with Google Assistant, Apple HomeKit, and other ecosystems, preserving consumer choice and interoperability. Amazon representatives underscored their long-term interest in expanding the smart home market, not restricting it, and argued that their acquisition was motivated by a vision to foster broader adoption rather than limit competition. Furthermore, Amazon refuted the foreclosure concerns by presenting detailed data demonstrating that third-party robot vacuum brands continue to account for significant sales volume on Amazon.com. They argued that marketplace algorithms were designed to optimize customer satisfaction and not to favor any specific brand unfairly. To address privacy concerns, Amazon reiterated strict data governance protocols and promised to uphold customer privacy standards, emphasizing that mapping data from Roomba devices would not be used for targeted advertising or shared beyond necessary operational purposes. The companies submitted merger-specific studies projecting that the combined entity would accelerate the development of next-generation home robotics products, including robotic lawnmowers and home security bots, thereby fostering competition with foreign manufacturers and preventing market stagnation. Investor presentations highlighted that the deal would bolster iRobot's research and development budget by tens of millions annually, enabling breakthrough innovations that could not be sustained as an independent company facing margin pressure. Additionally, the companies emphasized consumer benefits, such as improved integration across Amazon devices, creating seamless user experiences that reduce friction and complexity in managing multiple smart home products. They argued that these synergies would deliver real value in convenience, energy efficiency, and accessibility for users, particularly seniors and individuals with disabilities. In countering privacy concerns, Amazon pledged compliance with all relevant data protection laws, including GDPR in Europe and CCPA in California, and committed to transparent user controls over data sharing. They asserted that maintaining consumer trust was critical to their business model and that they had no incentive to jeopardize it by mishandling sensitive home mapping data. While critics questioned the certainty of these efficiencies, Amazon's defense team stressed the verifiable and merger-specific nature of the claimed benefits, contrasting them with the more speculative harms posited by opponents. The case for approval rested on the premise that the transaction would not only preserve but expand consumer choice and innovation in a rapidly evolving sector, contributing to the United States' technological leadership in robotics. As regulators weighed these arguments, the fundamental question remained: would the projected efficiencies materialize in ways that outweighed the risks of reduced competition and increased data concentration? The answer to this question would shape the fate of the deal and set a precedent for how antitrust authorities evaluate mergers at the intersection of hardware, software, and data ecosystems.
As the regulatory investigation deepened, a series of internal documents and communications surfaced that began to tip the balance in what critics termed the smoking gun phase of the Amazon iRobot review. Leaked emails from early 2022 revealed candid discussions among Amazon executives that underscored the strategic importance of spatial data and integration far beyond what had been publicly acknowledged. One email, dated March 15, 2022, from an Amazon senior product manager to the devices division leadership, explicitly referred to leveraging iRobot's spatial mapping to build a competitive moat around Alexa's smart home ecosystem. The memo outlined plans to use Roomba's floor plans to personalize product recommendations, and even hinted at potential partnerships with insurance providers for home risk assessment based on floor layouts. Such proposals alarmed privacy advocates and regulators alike, as they suggested uses of data that could extend well beyond convenience and home cleaning. Another internal presentation, circulated within Amazon's strategy team,
projected market scenarios showing Roomba commanding over 60% of the US robot vacuum market by 2025, if integrated tightly with Amazon's marketplace algorithms and marketing channels. The deck discussed self-preferencing tactics, acknowledging that owning the distribution platform allows for prioritizing in-house brands without overtly disadvantaging competitors in the eyes of consumers. Perhaps most damning was testimony from a whistleblower within iRobot's data science team, who revealed that prior to the deal, iRobot contractors had access to anonymized spatial data, which, while stripped of explicit personal identifiers, still contained detailed home layouts. The whistleblower warned that Amazon's acquisition risked expanding the scope and commercial use of such data in ways that iRobot had previously avoided due to privacy concerns. These revelations sent ripples through both the regulatory community and the press. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story detailing the implications of spatial data as the new frontier in consumer privacy, highlighting that Amazon's reach into the physical homes of millions was unprecedented. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill referenced the documents during hearings, questioning Amazon's assurances about privacy and competition. Amazon's legal team scrambled to contextualize the documents, arguing that internal memos reflected early-stage brainstorming and did not represent final policies. They insisted that all data use would comply with privacy laws and that commercial partnerships mentioned were exploratory, not imminent. Nevertheless, the damage to the company's narrative was palpable, shifting some regulatory skepticism into more overt opposition. This body of evidence crystallized the core concern that the merger's value to Amazon extended far beyond traditional synergies, instead resting on the control of unique, intimate data streams that competitors could not access. The smoking gun phase marked a turning point in the investigation, making it increasingly difficult for regulators to accept the benign explanations offered in earlier stages. As the public and political scrutiny intensified, both companies understood that the next few months would be decisive, not just for this deal, but for the broader question of how digital-age mergers are judged when data, hardware, and platform power converge.
Faced with mounting regulatory resistance and growing public scrutiny, Amazon and iRobot began exploring remedies that might salvage the merger without sacrificing the core strategic goals. The concept of remedies on the table quickly evolved into a complex negotiation dance, with proposals ranging from behavioral commitments to structural divestitures designed to appease antitrust authorities while preserving as much value as possible. One of the first and most prominent remedies Amazon proposed was a series of behavioral commitments aimed at preventing self-preferencing on its marketplace. These included pledges to maintain neutral search algorithms, transparency in sponsored product placements, and prohibitions against using iRobot's data to disadvantage competitors. The idea was to reassure regulators that the deal would not translate into manipulative marketplace conduct that could unfairly lock out rival brands. However, regulators expressed skepticism about the enforceability and monitoring of such behavioral remedies, citing past cases where promises were difficult to verify or enforce in practice. On the data privacy front, Amazon offered to implement firewalls to separate iRobot's spatial data from other Amazon datasets used for advertising or product recommendations. The company committed to third-party audits of its data governance practices and to provide users with enhanced control over how their Roomba data was collected, stored, and shared. Privacy advocates welcomed these gestures, but warned that firewalls are only as strong as the commitment to maintain them, and that once data silos are broken, it is almost impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. Structurally, regulators pushed for divestiture as a potential remedy. This could involve Amazon agreeing to spin off parts of iRobot's business, such as its software division or certain patents related to mapping technology. Such divestitures aim to preserve competition by ensuring that rivals could access essential technology or maintain independent platforms.
Amazon resisted these proposals vigorously, arguing that breaking up iRobot would undermine the very efficiencies and innovation the merger promised. The company pointed out that its control over iRobot was necessary for seamless integration of hardware, software, and cloud services, a key selling point to consumers. Another suggested remedy was granting open access to Roomba's spatial data to third-party developers and competitors under fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory or FRAND terms. This approach aimed to level the playing field by ensuring that data-driven advantages did not translate into insurmountable barriers to entry. While conceptually attractive to regulators, Amazon raised concerns about privacy risks and intellectual property protection, cautioning that indiscriminate data sharing could compromise consumer trust and stifle proprietary innovation. As the negotiation over remedies unfolded, the regulators remained cautious. Behavioral fixes, while less disruptive, carried risks of insufficient enforcement and gaming. Structural remedies promised a more durable solution, but faced pushback on grounds of market disruption and consumer confusion. The complexity of the smart home ecosystem, involving overlapping hardware, software, and services, made any remedy difficult to design and monitor effectively. By early 2023, the deal's fate appeared to hinge on whether Amazon could propose a package of remedies robust enough to satisfy regulators without gutting the strategic rationale for the acquisition. The stakes were high, and approval with conditions might set a precedent for future big tech mergers, while an outright block would send a strong signal about the limits of vertical integration in data-driven markets. The remedies discussion was not just a legal negotiation, it became a public debate about how to balance innovation, competition, and consumer protection in a digital economy where data is the new currency and physical devices are the new portals.
After months of intense review, public hearings, and back-and-forth negotiations over remedies, the moment of truth arrived in mid-2023. The Federal Trade Commission, European Commission, and UK's Competition and Markets Authority each announced their decisions on the Amazon iRobot merger, marking a critical inflection point not only for the companies involved, but for the regulatory landscape governing big tech and data-driven industries. In the United States, the FTC delivered a landmark ruling. The merger was blocked. The Commission concluded that the acquisition would substantially lessen competition in the robot vacuum market and grant Amazon an unassailable data advantage in the smart home ecosystem. Citing the risks of foreclosure, data concentration, and diminished innovation, the FTC underscored that behavioral remedies proposed by Amazon were insufficient to mitigate these harms. Chair Lina Khan, in her public statement, emphasized the agency's commitment to ensuring that dominant platforms do not use their gatekeeper power to distort markets to the detriment of consumers and competitors. Across the Atlantic, the European Commission reached a similar conclusion, but took a slightly different approach. While acknowledging Amazon's assurances and proposed remedies, the Commission found that the potential for self-preferencing and data misuse was too significant, and that structural remedies would be necessary. Amazon was offered the option to divest key parts of iRobot's mapping technology and agree to legally binding commitments on data separation. Amazon rejected these terms, leading to a formal prohibition of the deal within the EU jurisdiction. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority mirrored these concerns, issuing a provisional decision to block the merger unless Amazon agreed to substantial divestitures and enforceable data access commitments. The CMA warned that failing to address these issues would harm consumer choice and stifle competition in the burgeoning smart home market. The immediate market reaction was swift and telling. iRobot stock plummeted by over 35% on the day of the announcements, reflecting investor disappointment and uncertainty about the company's independent future. Amazon's shares dipped modestly as the ruling removed a key growth avenue but left its core business largely untouched. Analysts revised their forecasts, suggesting Amazon would now double down on organic smart home development, while iRobot faced mounting pressure to restructure or seek alternative partnerships. Amazon's legal team quickly announced intentions to challenge the FTC's ruling in court, framing the decision as an overreach that could hamper American innovation and competitiveness on the global stage. CEO Andy Jassy emphasized the company's commitment to working with regulators to find a solution that benefits customers and the broader tech ecosystem. iRobot's board expressed disappointment, but affirmed its dedication to continuing innovation as an independent company. The decision sent ripples far beyond the immediate parties. The rulings became a precedent-setting moment in antitrust enforcement, signaling regulators' growing willingness to scrutinize vertical mergers involving data-rich platforms and hardware companies. For big tech, the message was clear. Dominant platforms seeking to extend their reach through acquisitions face increasing hurdles, especially when data concentration and marketplace power intersect. For consumers and competitors alike, the decisions offered both relief and uncertainty. While competition was preserved in the short term, the broader question of how to regulate data-driven ecosystems remained unresolved. The battle over the Amazon iRobot deal was over, but the war over the limits of platform power had only just begun.
The regulatory rejections of the Amazon iRobot merger triggered immediate and palpable consequences across multiple fronts. For iRobot, the fallout was swift and stark. The company's stock price plunged over 35% on the day the decisions were announced, wiping out billions in market capitalization and fueling anxiety among investors about its viability as an independent entity. Confidence in iRobot's growth trajectory took a serious hit, with analysts slashing revenue and profit forecasts amid fears the company would struggle to compete without Amazon's financial and logistical support. Internally, morale reportedly dipped as employees grappled with the uncertainty of layoffs, budget cuts, and potential restructuring. Amazon, while less directly affected financially, faced a different set of challenges. Its share price experienced a modest decline, reflecting investor disappointment but also recognition that the company's core retail and cloud businesses remained robust. However, the blocked deal underscored the growing constraints regulators were imposing on Amazon's expansion strategies, signaling that future acquisitions, especially those involving data-rich hardware, would face intense scrutiny. The company's legal and public affairs teams immediately pivoted to damage control, emphasizing their commitment to innovation and openness to alternative growth avenues. One of the most tangible sunk costs was the approximately $94 million breakup fee Amazon agreed to pay iRobot under the merger agreement. This sizable sum represented a direct financial penalty for the failed transaction, and a reminder of the high stakes involved in pursuing such deals in a challenging regulatory environment. Additionally, both companies incurred millions more in legal, consulting, and lobbying expenses during the drawn-out review process, expenses that would never be recovered. Operationally, the failure to merge forced iRobot to revisit its strategic plans under severe constraints. The company announced cost-cutting measures, including layoffs estimated at 15% of its workforce, and a reevaluation of its R&D pipeline. With mounting competitive pressure from Chinese manufacturers like Roborock and Ecovacs, who had not been subject to similar regulatory scrutiny, iRobot faced an uphill battle to maintain its market position and innovation lead. Some executives privately speculated about seeking alternative partnerships or even a future sale under different terms. Within Amazon, the decision prompted a strategic recalibration. The company doubled down on internal development of smart home technologies, accelerating projects related to voice assistants, security devices, and home automation systems that did not rely on acquisitions. Analysts observed a renewed focus on organic growth and innovation in device software, AI capabilities, and cloud services integration. Amazon also began exploring partnerships rather than outright acquisitions, seeking to sidestep regulatory pitfalls while maintaining a competitive edge. The broader message to the tech industry was unmistakable.
The decision illustrated the increasing difficulty of navigating regulatory landscapes as antitrust authorities sharpen their focus on data-driven vertical mergers. It underscored the necessity for companies to prepare for protracted reviews, higher legal costs, and potential deal failures. For investors and dealmakers, the Amazon iRobot saga became a cautionary tale about the evolving boundaries of corporate expansion in the digital era. In the immediate aftermath, public and political discourse also intensified. Consumer advocacy groups hailed the regulatory decisions as victories for privacy and competition, using the case to call for stronger, clearer rules governing data monopolies and platform dominance. Lawmakers leveraged the case to push for legislative reforms aimed at reining in big tech's reach into connected home devices and personal data ecosystems. Ultimately, the immediate fallout from the blocked merger reverberated far beyond the balance sheets of two companies. It reshaped industry expectations, accelerated regulatory vigilance, and marked a turning point in the ongoing debate about how to balance innovation, competition, and consumer protection in an increasingly connected world.
The blocking of the Amazon iRobot deal sent clear and lasting ripples through the smart home and consumer robotics industries, signaling a new era of heightened regulatory scrutiny and shifting competitive dynamics. Competitors, investors, and innovators alike recalibrated their strategies, mindful that the landscape they operated in was being fundamentally reshaped by regulatory intervention. For established players such as Roborock, Echovex, SharkNinja, and others, the decision was both a reprieve and a wake-up call. The blocked acquisition preserved the competitive status quo, preventing Amazon from leveraging marketplace dominance and unique data assets to crush rivals. Yet it also underscored the fragile balance these companies faced. While regulators acted to preserve competition, the market's technological evolution demanded rapid innovation and scale. Many accelerated investments in AI-driven navigation, voice assistant integration, and cross-platform compatibility to capture market share before further consolidation could occur. Retailers outside Amazon's ecosystem, including Best Buy, Walmart, and Target, breathed a sigh of relief. The decision maintained their ability to compete on equal footing, preserving critical shelf space and marketing opportunities for competing robot vacuum brands. Some retailers took the opportunity to deepen partnerships with alternative smart home manufacturers, diversifying their offerings to meet growing consumer demand. Startups and emerging innovators saw the ruling as an encouraging sign that the market remained open for disruption. Venture capitalists, however, grew increasingly cautious, understanding that potential acquirers might face tougher regulatory barriers. This led to a subtle shift in funding patterns, with greater emphasis on organic growth and strategic partnerships over quick exits through acquisition by big tech giants. At a broader level, the smart home industry began to coalesce around standards and interoperability initiatives aimed at fostering a more open ecosystem. The decision it spotlighted concerns about vertical integration stifling cross-platform compatibility, encouraging industry groups to promote protocols that would allow devices to communicate regardless of manufacturer or platform. These efforts aim to counteract fears that dominant players could monopolize user data and device control. The ruling also reverberated through adjacent sectors: home security, IoT devices, and AI-powered personal assistants. It served as a cautionary tale to companies considering mergers that blended hardware, software, and data control. Firms recalibrated M&A pipelines, increasingly conducting preemptive regulatory risk assessments and engaging early with antitrust authorities to navigate the complex approval processes. From a policy perspective, the case became a foundational example cited in ongoing legislative debates around digital market regulation. Lawmakers referenced it as evidence of the need for clearer rules on data concentration, platform gatekeeping, and vertical mergers. The ruling fed into the momentum behind frameworks like the EU's Digital Markets Act and proposals for similar legislation in the US,
reinforcing calls for proactive rather than reactive antitrust enforcement. Consumer behavior was not immune to these industry ripples. Awareness of data privacy issues in smart home devices grew, prompting more cautious purchasing decisions and increased demand for transparent data practices. Some consumers shifted toward brands that explicitly emphasize open ecosystems and robust privacy protections. In sum, the Amazon iRobot saga reshaped the smart home industry's competitive and regulatory landscape. It reinforced the success in the connected home would require not just technological innovation, but strategic navigation of complex legal and social expectations. The ruling marked a new equilibrium, one in which innovation, competition, and privacy must coexist under the vigilant eye of regulators, consumers, and industry stakeholders alike.
The Amazon iRobot merger saga did not just conclude with a regulatory decision. It set a precedent that would reverberate through antitrust policy and enforcement for years to come. As one of the first high-profile cases involving the intersection of data-rich hardware, platform dominance, and vertical integration, it became a foundational reference point in shaping how regulators approach mergers in the digital age. Regulators across jurisdictions cited the case as evidence of the growing need to update traditional antitrust frameworks to address new forms of market power rooted in data control and platform ecosystems. The case underscored that dominance in one market, such as e-commerce retail, could translate into disproportionate leverage in adjacent markets like smart home hardware when combined through mergers. This vertical nexus posed challenges that horizontal merger precedents did not fully anticipate. In the United States, the decision influenced the Biden administration's broader antitrust agenda, reinforcing Chair Lina Khan's call for a more aggressive stance on big tech consolidation. The Federal Trade Commission subsequently revised its merger guidelines to include clearer language on data concentration and self-preferencing risks, signaling that future deals involving dominant platforms and data-rich assets would face heightened scrutiny. The case became a teaching point in enforcement training and legal scholarship alike. Europe's Digital Markets Act, DMA, which was finalized shortly after the Amazon iRobot decision, incorporated explicit provisions targeting gatekeeper platforms' mergers with hardware providers controlling key data streams. The European Commission's approach to remedies and prohibitions in this case directly informed the DMA's emphasis on data interoperability, fair access, and prevention of self-preferencing practices. The Amazon iRobot case thus became a cornerstone in Europe's effort to proactively regulate digital markets rather than reacting post hoc. The United Kingdom's Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, used the case as a springboard for developing its own guidelines on data-driven vertical mergers, emphasizing the importance of considering non-price harms such as innovation dampening and privacy erosion. The CMA increased collaboration with international counterparts to ensure coordinated responses to multinational tech mergers. Policy debates and legislative bodies worldwide also drew on the case. Lawmakers referenced it when proposing new laws aimed at data portability, platform neutrality, and enhanced merger review processes. The case fueled arguments for stronger enforcement tools, including the ability to block mergers based on potential data monopolization, even absent immediate price effects. Academic and industry circles studied the decision intensively, debating the balance between promoting innovation and preventing market concentration. The Amazon iRobot case illustrated that traditional economic models focused on price and output were insufficient to capture the nuanced harms and benefits of data-centric mergers. This sparked calls for integrating privacy, consumer choice, and data governance into antitrust analyses. Ultimately, the case created a new paradigm. Mergers in digital ecosystems must be evaluated not only on direct competitive effects, but also on data synergies and platform gatekeeping risks. It established a policy blueprint that regulators and lawmakers continue to refine as technology evolves. As the industry moves forward, the Amazon iRobot precedent stands as a warning and a guidepost,
a testament to the complexities of balancing dynamic innovation with robust competition in an interconnected, data-driven economy.
The Amazon iRobot merger saga offered executives and deal-makers a series of hard-earned lessons in navigating the treacherous waters of big tech M&A in an era defined by data, platforms, and regulatory scrutiny. The complexity of this deal underscored that success in such transactions requires far more than financial engineering. It demands strategic foresight, disciplined narrative control, and meticulous stakeholder management. First, timing proved critical. The deal was announced amid a political climate increasingly hostile to tech consolidation, with regulators emboldened by public concerns over data privacy and market concentration. Executives learned that pushing through high-profile acquisitions without carefully assessing the regulatory environment's pulse risked prolonged investigations or outright blocks. Preemptive engagement with regulators, including early and transparent disclosure of data practices and competitive impacts, could have helped frame a more cooperative review. Second, the power of narrative and data discipline emerged as a central theme. Amazon's attempts to position the deal as an innovation booster were met with skepticism, partly because internal documents revealed strategic intentions that diverged from public messaging. Companies must maintain tight control over communications, ensuring consistency between internal planning and external statements. Contradictory or overly optimistic claims can provide regulators and critics with ammunition, eroding trust and undermining defense efforts. Third, stakeholder management extended beyond investors and regulators to encompass suppliers, competitors, consumer advocates, employees, and the public. The deal illustrated how broad-based opposition, from consumer groups alarmed by privacy implications to retailers fearing exclusion, can influence regulatory outcomes. Proactively addressing these concerns through engagement and concessions can reduce opposition and build a coalition supportive of the transaction. Fourth, remedy design must be robust and credible. Behavioral remedies, while attractive for preserving deal value, often fall short in the eyes of regulators due to enforcement challenges. Structural remedies, though disruptive, may offer clearer assurances of competition preservation. Companies should anticipate regulators' preferences and be ready to propose remedies that balance business goals with enforceability. Lastly, executives must embrace regulatory uncertainty as a strategic factor. The evolving nature of antitrust enforcement, especially in digital markets, means that precedent and policy can shift rapidly. Building flexibility into deal structures, allowing for contingency plans, and investing in regulatory affairs capabilities are essential to managing risk. In sum, the Amazon iRobot case serves as a cautionary tale and a strategic guidepost. Future big tech mergers will require holistic strategies that integrate legal, operational, communicational, and political dimensions. Deals that neglect any of these facets risk not only financial loss, but lasting reputational damage and operational disruption. By internalizing these lessons, executives can better navigate the complex intersection of innovation, competition, and regulation that defines today's technology landscape. As the dust settled on the blocked Amazon iRobot merger, the industry found itself at a crossroads, a moment both uncertain and ripe with possibility. The decision marked not just the end of one deal, but the opening chapter in a larger story about how smart homes, robotics, and data ecosystems would evolve under the watchful eyes of regulators, competitors, and consumers alike. Technology continues to advance at a relentless pace. Innovations in artificial intelligence, edge computing, and sensor miniaturization promise to make connected devices smarter, more autonomous, and deeply integrated into daily life. The vision of a truly intelligent home, where appliances anticipate needs, security systems adapt in real time, and robots perform a growing range of tasks, is closer than ever. Yet the pathway to this future is now more complex, shaped by regulatory boundaries and societal expectations about privacy, choice, and fairness. In the wake of the Amazon iRobot saga, companies pursuing growth in the smart home space must navigate a landscape where data is currency, but also liability. Partnerships, alliances, and open standards may become more valuable strategies than aggressive acquisitions, as firms seek to balance innovation with compliance. New entrants and startups might find both opportunity and challenge in this environment, as barriers to scale rise, but consumer demand grows. Regulators themselves face a formidable task. Crafting policies and enforcement frameworks that protect competition and privacy without stifling innovation will require ongoing adaptation, dialogue with industry, and technical expertise. The Amazon iRobot case has become a touchstone in this endeavor, illustrating both the power and the limits of antitrust tools in digital markets. For consumers, awareness and activism around data privacy and smart home technologies are likely to increase. Demand for transparency, control over personal information, and interoperability will shape purchasing decisions and corporate strategies alike. The notion of privacy by design and ethical AI in consumer products is transitioning from niche concern to mainstream expectation. Looking ahead, the deal wars season of antitrust battles is far from over. Other tech giants continue to pursue acquisitions, some less visible but equally significant in shaping market dynamics. Regulators worldwide are sharpening their playbooks, emboldened by precedents like the Amazon iRobot decision. The question remains, how will the balance between innovation, competition, and consumer protection be struck in an increasingly interconnected world? As this story closes, it naturally leads to the next, whether that involves emerging players, new regulatory frameworks, or revolutionary technologies that redefine what a smart home means. The saga serves as a reminder that in the digital era, the stakes of mergers go beyond dollars. They touch the fabric of everyday life. For viewers and industry watchers alike, the Amazon iRobot case offers a rich, unfolding narrative about power, technology, and the quest to build a future that is both innovative and just. And with regulatory decisions setting the stage, the countdown to the next chapter has already begun.